Hello, everybody, and welcome to Getting APIs to Work. Today, we'll talk about Postel's Law, the robustness principle. It's very important for communicating computers in a variety of levels. And we have Mike Amundsen with us who will talk us through what the law is, what it does, what it means. Hey, Mike, how are you doing?
All right, good to be back with you, and happy to talk to you about Postel and his robustness principle today.
Yeah, it's another law. So we had Goodhart
It's a lot.
recently, which is one of my
Yeah,
favorite laws. But
yeah,
Postel also ranks pretty highly, I would say. Let's
yeah.
jump
I,
right
I run
into
into it a
it.
lot.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think we
So
we all do.
so so John Postel was very instrumental in establishing the way the IETF does its standards documents, RFCs, requests for comments. So he kind of enshrined the way the IETF writes documentation and standards. So he's a very well-known person, and one of the early standards he worked on was for TCP, the early packet level details of TCP and IP and all those things like that. So he wrote in one of these early TCP documents, packet level documents, this great line which has become known as the robustness principle, which is, in general, an implementation should be conservative in its sending behavior and liberal in its receiving behavior. So what does that mean? And there's probably a more popular version of that. What do you think?
A little bit, even though I think it's fairly closely aligned. I think most people would think about Postel's law as be conservative in what you send and be liberal in what you accept. Just as a general rule of communications, one might even say that it's helpful for robust communications that to a certain extent you accept certain things that may not be 100% what you expect, but you still accept them. But whenever you emit messages or you talk to a peer, you try to be as strict as possible.
Yeah, and why is this important? I mean, what's the thinking behind this? Why this seems to be a kind of a peculiar standpoint for packet level communications where things need to be very accurate. There's millions and billions of packets. Why this liberal attitude or this sort of accepting attitude at some level? What's the advantage, you think?
The advantage, and I think the reason why we find this law so appealing even today, is that this allows you to be more robust in having an evolving system where not everybody is following the exact same rules. Nobody is maybe implementing the exact same standards because standards evolve over time. So there is a variety of communicating peers that have sometimes slightly different assumptions about what's okay and what's not okay. And in order to make that as robust as you can, it helps if you have some rule in place or some guidelines in place that allow things to maybe fail a little less often. And I think that's the challenge that I think we all have when we design and build open systems, that you don't control everybody who's in it, and you have to think about what does it mean and how can I still build a working system.
Yeah, I think actually, especially that last point really touches on something that I've thought about for quite a while, and that is you don't control others. You're actually in a community. We're sort of in this world where there are lots of machines, as you say, maybe doing slightly different things or having slightly different versions, or even having a slightly different interpretation of the exact same standards document. Boy, does that happen every once in a while? So we have to figure out how to get along. We have to figure out how to successfully communicate. And I think one of the points that Postel was talking about was sort of addressing is this idea that if you require everything to be perfect every time you receive a packet, you're going to be greatly disappointed. It's just not how the world works. And if you just reject communications if it's not perfect, then you'll find that most of the packets get rejected. You have to be somewhat liberal and say, well, it's close enough. I understand it. Maybe it's missing a space or something. Let me go ahead. So I think that was one of the things that he was talking about, is because there are some other writings where he basically talks about how it's important to kind of protect yourself, but it's important to also make it better for the rest of the network as well. So I think there's another level to all of this, which is in the real world, you have to accept people for what they are. You have to accept machines for what they say, and if you can work with it, fine. So I think that's part of the story as well.
That, and I think the other part of the story also is that, at least in part, Postel's law is also about evolvability. And so some examples also are around, well, if this field is supposed to have certain values in it, and you find a different value, then what do? Right? Do you just like put your hands up and say, oh my God, I don't know what to do, and everything just breaks down, which sometimes may be the appropriate behavior. But in other cases, it might also be that you maybe can safely ignore it. Maybe there's some default rules around what to do if you find if you find a value you don't expect. Right? So I think that's also an important part of Postel's law, is to always think about, how do I behave maybe a year or 2 years from now when other people start implementing things in a different way, because things will have evolved by then. And I think that's the tricky part, that because it does almost require a little bit of looking into the future.
Yep, and I think that's another great observation, and that is you just added time as sort of part of this whole story, right? Things change over time. We sort of imagine right now it works perfectly, everybody understands everything, but what happens a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now? Some of these standards, like TCP/IP, is more than 30 years old, right? I mean, they've been around a long time. So how do they last this long? Well, they have to take into account some of what you just talked about evolvability and adaptability. One of the other related, so RFC 760 is the one that actually first talked about this idea of being strict and being liberal, and there are several other ones after that talk about the same thing.
That shows us that it's pretty old, because right now I think we're past 9,000 in the
Yes.
RFC. No, I don't think we're at
Are we
9,000.
actually at
Somewhere around.
9,000?
Maybe not
Oh
quite,
man,
but we're close. We're close. We're definitely close.
that is amazing.
Yeah.
Some of the earliest ones, right?
Yeah.
But he also in another RFC 1122 he talks about this idea of an example that you just gave, which is maybe there's an enumerator that says there are 4 possible values, and you get a 5th value that you hadn't expected. What do you do? And one of the things that he says is you must not fail, you must not crash, right? So that's a big part of this adaptability, evolvability, getting along with others. You have to ignore it, or you have to decide to do something else. And a lot of times you've written specifications. A lot of the specifications writing is actually making up for others. Like, well, what if others are going to assume? What do we do when something isn't quite right? I mean, that's a big part of writing specifications, isn't it?
Oh, yes.
Do you have a
Yes.
story to tell?
No, it's my life story, so to speak. Not quite, but yes, that's a good part. And in particular, and you can tell, in particular, when you participate in standardization efforts in the IETF, it's amazing the amount of feedback you get from really good people, and it's really good feedback, right? That tell you, well, you have to think about this. Like, what you have to think about, what should happen if this comes along, even though we say this shouldn't come along. And then ideally, maybe you also say clearly, okay, if this comes along, that's kind of okay. So it can be safely ignored. Or you also can say, if this comes along, you just have to stop. It's so unclear what this should mean, or this is just not within a reasonable space where you can recover, that anybody who receives something that doesn't fit this should just stop and say, I don't know what to do, but it's not safe to proceed. And I think also specifications have become much better at that. And that's probably just also a like a result of the fact that we just have so much more experience and so many more systems around, that we've learned that yes, you have to think about that. It has to be, you can't just also just specify the happy path, so to speak.
Yes.
Right. So you also have to specify, you have to help people what to do when the happy path is not what's happening.
Yeah, I think again, I think that's another really important lesson that I had to learn as I got involved in the specification community. I was thinking, why are we talking about all of these things, until it starts to dawn on me how many different angles there are, and there are lots of not happy paths that you need to at least be prepared for. You can't necessarily treat everyone with a specific solution, but you have to have an overall kind of point of view, and I think that's a big part of it. Postel himself, even, there's a line in some of his writings that we have to kind of assume that the network is filled with what he called malevolent entities that will send packets designed for the worst effect. You can't assume everybody is on board. You can't assume everybody's happy. Sometimes you have to assume bad things could happen, and what do you do then? So a lot of this robustness isn't just being a good citizen. It's also protecting yourself and then protecting others in the process, so that you don't mistakenly assume something and then turn up doing something bad, right?
Yes. Plus, I think in many cases, at least now, if we look at the space where we are dealing with a lot with APIs, I think in most cases it's probably not malevolent. But what it is it's just clueless, right? It's like people do stuff, they program against your API in ways where you could say, well, that's not what I told you my API would work like. But
Yeah.
they do that because they don't really read the spec. They just try out things, right? So they do things that are technically speaking not okay. And then the question is for you is also, well, what now, right? What do I do? And I think that is something that we, in the API space in particular, that's what you see a lot, is the question of how strict are you against implementations that don't behave perfectly, but where also in your interest it may be to say, well, it's still a client, it's still a customer, it's still somebody that I want to make as happy as possible. So maybe it makes sense for me to accept certain things when I have some degree of confidence that this is what they really wanted to do.
Right. And also, I think the idea of just saying this is good enough. I think that's another aspect. I'll use just a real simple example. When I was implementing a server-side API, and there's a sort of some rules about properties that are accepted and properties that are, these are the only ones that are acceptable, either required or optional or whatever. And I decided if somebody sends in like an extra property, like there are 5 possibles, and they send in properties 6 and 7, you've got 2 options. You can reject the whole thing and say, no, that's wrong. Or I can just ignore the 2 that I'm not supposed to accept. Everything else is okay. Take that, save that, say thank you very much. Right? So one option is to fail and reject everything, and the other option is to go ahead and carry on and just ignore the other 2 items. And from a structural standpoint, or sort of a system standpoint, that second option, just to carry on, results in a more robust system. I've kind of now got a rule that makes sure that even if people send in 30 or 40 items, I'm not going to get upset. I don't have to solve for every problem either. I have a sort of a generalized rule. And I think that's part of the story on APIs. It's not so much, like you say, that people are going to be malevolent or hacking. It's just that, maybe they built it slightly different at this moment, and they're just trying to learn. They're just trying to get ahead. So that's where I can be liberal in a case like that, right?
And I think you can also make that part of your API design. So for example, one pattern that I really like is to kind of echo back things to people and say, thank you very much. Here is what I heard you were saying, right? So if they send me those 7 things and 2 of those I don't understand, I would just echo back the 5 things and give them a confirmation and say, this is what I think you were trying to tell me. And then it's basically up to them to maybe say, no, these two things were really important for me, so let's just stop here. Or they can say, okay, you ignored those two, but that's fine. And you can move on. So I think you can even build that into API designs and have this. It's almost like if you go to a restaurant, right, and you order 5 things and 2 of those are not on the menu, you might also expect that they still bring you those 3 things and they say, these 2 things we don't have, they don't exist, but then that may be the best possible thing to do. So I think there's also a lesson for us as designers where we can say you can have conversation patterns that kind of give you this kind of confirmation, and maybe that's too complicated sometimes, or it creates too much traffic depending on what you do, but it also can be something that helps these conversations in itself to be more robust.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that's really true. So another thing that I do pretty regularly is, there's a lot of in API space. There's a lot of use of schemas to validate a message, right? So I try to not use schemas on inbound messages. Like I try not to be strict in what I accept. I'll actually look for those 3 or 4 things that I understand, use those, ignore the rest. So, but on the way out, when I'm crafting a message to send to you or to somebody else, I often will use a schema validator to make sure that I'm as correct as I possibly could be. And I think that's another pattern that sort of is the API level version or the service level version of Postel's Law, which is to be as liberal in what I accept, not use a schema, but to be very strict in what I send is to use one. So that's an example that I use very often.
That is, I think, very Postel-y thing to do. I like that. Back in the days, because you said that, back in the days when we had XML, I think XML actually was really nice because XML had these models of lax and strict validation. So I think in XML, you almost even had sort of this Postel-iness, so to speak, built into the schema language, because you could use the lax model for incoming stuff and say, there still needs to be some rhyme and reason to this whole thing, or it doesn't make any sense. But then you could use the strict validation model for outgoing things and say, I'll behave perfectly because that's what I want to do. So I always like that part of XML, but we don't. I don't think JSON schema doesn't have that, right? I don't think that.
Well, actually, JSON schema has this idea called additional properties, right? So it will actually, by default, ignore additional properties in a message in the schema translation unless you flip the bit to say don't allow additional things. So I actually appreciate the fact that JSON schema starts from the point of allowing extra bits and just passing them along and not failing on them. So I like that aspect of it. There are other aspects of JSON schema that are a little bit more challenging, but that's a pretty good case for doing the same kind of Postel-y thing.
Okay.
You're laughing at my JSON schema skills. Is that what you're doing?
No, I'm laughing at how you said, there are other things that let's not talk about those now.
There's some challenges. So what are we to conclude from Postel's Law? What do we take away here from this idea of the robustness principle? We've talked about a handful of things. What are the things that you think are sort of the top level things that we should remember?
So my main takeaway from Postel always is that at the very minimal level, it forces you to think a little bit about how do you behave in an evolving world where not everybody is following the exact same rules. And it also ideally, and that's, I think we discussed that, what happens in the internet standards right now, ideally it may even help you to create your own specifications in a way that already help the implementer a little bit in saying, yeah, this is kind of okay, this is really not okay. And I think that's the main thing, that if you want to create robust conversation patterns, then being liberal to some extent is okay, but it's a slippery slope, right? You can't
Yep.
just make stuff up and say, I think you wanted to do this.
Yep.
It's a slippery slope. And the more we as designers of conversations, and that is always the important part for me, right? As API people, we design languages, we design
Yes.
conversations. And
Yes.
us as conversation, as language designers, we do a better job when we take this into account and help people to better deal with the problems that Postel's law addresses.
Yep. I echo all of that. I tend to think about it the same way. It's not just that we're trying to protect ourselves, but we're also trying to protect others. We're not just trying to improve our own evolvability or adaptability. We're trying to improve the evolvability and adaptability of the community, of the network, of all of the services. So designing these communication patterns in ways that allow us to safely continue working even if things aren't perfect is really helping all of us to become better at communicating. And that's, to me, what the API system is all about. And I think, even though Postel was working on a very much lower level than APIs, and this packet level, I think it's okay to apply the same general notion up here at this sort of API communication language level too. So I think, do your best to accept what you can and be very careful in what you send, and it makes it better for everyone. I think that's a great way to think about the robust principle.
I think that is the perfect way to conclude this. Thank you very much, Mike. That was another really good law, I think, for us to discuss. And I hope that everybody who watched this now comes away with a better understanding of what Postel's law means, and everybody is designing better conversations so that we understand each other better. So with that, thanks everybody. Thanks, Mike.
See ya.
Okay, yeah, see you. Bye-bye.